Hello and welcome everybody to today's Earshot Professional Development webinar. If you don't know who I am, my name is Larab K. Raphael. I'm the Director of Composer Advancement for the American Composers Orchestra. And just a few things before we get started. Obviously, this webinar is a part of our Earshot initiative. And Earshot, for those who don't know, is the nation's first systemic program for building relationships between orchestras and composers through earshot readings, collaboratory residencies, our consortium commissions, which we'll be talking about today, publishing, and professional development sessions like these. Earshot expands the definition of American orchestral music to ensure a vibrant and inclusive future for the field. Earshot is operated in partnership with the League of American Orchestras, New Music USA, and the American Composers Forum, and lead support is provided by the From Music Foundation. For more information on our professional development series and any other opportunities, please visit our website, americancomposers.org. Now, as we move through today's session, please feel free to offer any questions that you may have using the Q&A function here on Zoom. That'll be the easiest way for me to see them. And if you'd like to come onto the screen to ask your question at the end of today's presentation, feel free to use the hand raise function on Zoom, and I'll bring as many of you on screen as time allows. I'll also be offering a survey in the chat at the conclusion of today's presentation. So if you wouldn't mind clicking that link when it appears and offering your feedback, it will be much appreciated. Today's session, titled Put Me On, Commissions and Consortia, asserts that there's a lot more to getting a commission and building a consortium than writing a piece of great music. In this webinar, we will dialogue with one of today's most successful composers and managers about the ins and outs of navigating collaborative relationships, contracts, fee negotiations, and so much more. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to ACO's CEO, Melissa Ngan, who will introduce our guests. Melissa.
Hello, welcome. Thank you so much, Laurent. Really appreciate the introduction. And I'd like to welcome our guests. So, composer Jeff Scott, first and foremost, welcome to the screen. Just want to say thank you so much for being here. I know you've had a very complicated travel day and you're dialing in from your home office, and I'm just very, very grateful to have you. And also Dan Visconti of Visconti Arts, who looks after Jeff's activities. Dan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Oh my gosh. Well, this is going to be a great conversation, and I'm grateful to the two of you because I think this is really helpful to be able to, first of all, work with a composer who has had such an incredible body of work, both as a founding member of Amani Winds, one of our most favorite ensembles ever to exist, and one that is very connected to ACO on a personal level through multiple people, and also through your work as an instrumentalist, as a composer. Like, there's so many ways that you've been active in the world, and I think being able to talk about that pathway is going to be a huge part of today's discussion, along with many projects that have brought many orchestras and other entities together to commission your work in joint form, so in the form of a consortium. And Dan, I know that as a highly successful composer yourself and someone who has leveraged those skills to support the work of others, you're going to bring a lot to this conversation in terms of strategy, tactics, and the nuts and bolts of how to get these projects off the ground. So thank you so very much for both of you for being here. I really appreciate it. And just a note for everybody who is attending today, I believe that our link was somehow haunted and all of you have my name, which is hilarious. So if you have a moment to rename yourself, I'm going to know who you are. And if you raise your hand, I'm going to have a slightly less being John Malkovich moment when I call on you. So thank you all so much. This is really stroking my ego in ways you couldn't possibly imagine, but please do claim your own name back in the attendee window. So Jeff, I want to just start with you. I want to just hear a little bit about your pathway. You've been active in so many ways throughout your career. If you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about your pathway to where you are right now so that we can understand all of the ways that you've built relationships and built artistic projects over time.
Wow, absolutely. Well, thank you, first of all, Melissa. It's just a great opportunity to chat with folks and share a little bit. You know, I started out with Imani Winds. Now it's been 28 years, although I formally left the group 4 years ago. And my whole sort of dive into composition actually started with arranging music. Um, we were part of a wind quintet, and anyone who knows wind quintet at all knows that there really isn't very much. And if you don't know that, that's the whole problem. There's just not a whole lot out there. So myself and the founding member of Imani Winds, Valerie Holman, we decided to set out on our own and just start creating more, just a bigger body of music for the wind quintet genre. And I have to say, just hearing the compositions that Valerie was bringing in, we did arranging and original music, but I started out arranging. But I was listening to how she created colors, and folks, if you don't know who Valerie Coleman is, I'd almost say stop listening to this webinar and go listen to her music. But I just started listening to her colors, and I learned so much just being not only around her music making, but that ensemble's music making and the possibilities that could happen when you're around such incredible musicians. And so I had the best lab band. I could bring in 20 bars of music and immediately get feedback. And I knew if it didn't sound good, it was likely because I wrote bad music. It's hard for Imani Winds to sound bad. Um, and the biggest part about that was that we were putting all of our music, Valerie and my own, on the biggest stages. And so it was getting exposure immediately. And exposure at that level means that, people will come to you and ask you for commissions or ask you to, arrange something. And one thing led to another. And I started getting a commission here and a commission there. Next thing you know, I was quitting the group to be a composer. Who knew?
That's amazing. And, one follow up question. First of all, I will say, like, hearing about your experiences as an arranger and having like the best lab band in the world, like, that resonates so much. I have been a fangirl of Amani Winds for many years. And one of the things I've always appreciated is even when you are, when you are playing music by other composers, like, just the ability to make it a signature of Amani Winds, like, make it your own. Like, there was always such a creativity in that group. So it's amazing. I'm curious what it felt like to say, okay, I'm a composer now. When did you know that that was the case? Was it an interesting moment? Was there a single moment? Was it an evolution over time? I'm curious about that transition.
It's very easily answered. I wrote a piece for Imani Winds called "Homage to Duke," and Duke being Duke Ellington. And it was an original work, but it used his very famous hymn "Come Sunday" as sort of the focal part of it. And we toured that piece that I wrote over a season. And after every performance, I mean, Imani Winds would get applause, of course, after performance, but after every performance of that piece, you either got like this collective or like this roaring applause. And I just thought, that's like candy for a composer, to have people accept your music on those stages, and with that sort of a reception. And it was right then that I knew that, at least I was on the right path for, writing music that would be pleasing to audiences, which at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's great. And Dan, I want to come to you so that, everyone from a level setting perspective knows who's in the room and what your experiences have been. As you've been founding your agency, which works with a lot of composers, what are some of the things that have been important to you and that you've been thinking about at this stage of your journey?
Well, thanks. It's been especially interesting for me just because I have that experience of having been a composer in my former life and having a little bit of that direct experience. And well, I try to make sure that artists I work with are by no means limited by only my experience. I try to make sure that I'm looking at, the network of all kinds of people I've interacted with and the different kinds of learning that take place from wearing the hat of a creator, wearing the hat of a curator, of a consultant, and, now somebody who's responsible for managing the careers of absolutely extraordinary artists like Jeff. And a couple things is that there's so many ways that composers are creating today that I think that that's something that I really want to take into account. And of course, the path into composition is very different. There's a lot of, in my humble opinion, some of the most amazing and vital voices in American music right now are coming from people who didn't start out and say, golly, I want to be a composer is the first thing I do. It's often people who are coming at it from a performance background, maybe from outside of classical music entirely. So those are things that I really wanted to make sure that our agency is sensitive to and able to help, and that we have the equipment to make sure that artists who are doing extraordinary work, who are doing the most creative stuff, and not just doing the typical thing over and over, have the right way to express that. And that has to do with materials, it has to do with clear communication. So those are some of the things that we've been trying to hone and make sure we're there to support composers, especially and creators, as they take on their most daring projects.
Amazing. Thank you so very much. And so I kind of want to just get into what I would consider to be one of the most important things as a baseline for any conversation like this, and any conversation about how to build a life in the arts, frankly, which is about how to build great relationships. And Jeff, I want to sort of come to you. This was something that you brought up in our planning, which I thought was such an important insight. Talk to me a little bit about how your pathway didn't just prepare you artistically, but in terms of building your tribe of support for the types of artistic work you would want to do.
Yeah, and we in Imani Wins, we always said that the whole idea of having success was not getting a gig, but getting that gig again. Being called back, which means you were not only did well, but you created a relationship between yourself and the whole organization that you brought your art to, that they wanted to continue and actually grow, and progress and expand. And so that's just my mentality when it comes to trying to just increase my visibility in the arts, is that I just think about the relationships that I have with the folks that are in my circle, and I try to keep them as honest and I commit myself to them. Deadlines and communication and everything, and just making sure that everybody involved is on the same page. And when you're doing that, you're just making the relationship itself as healthy as possible. Of course, everybody's got a job to do, and my job is to write the best possible music I can. But at the end of the day, it's about the relationship building and the relationship between yourself, the presenting organization, and then their constituency.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I'm curious, how did those conversations transition over time? People who knew you as a performer and got excited about you and the possibility of having music made through a commission. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you've transitioned those relationships and continued to lean on.
Well, it was a sort of an odd transition, because I was playing in a pretty successful touring ensemble. And so while I was getting some commissions, folks didn't really see me as a full-time composer. And I actually had a conversation with a dear colleague, and friend of mine. His name is David Shrebnick. I was about 3 or 4 years before I kind of knew in advance that I was going to sort of bow out from touring. And he was doing some consultant work and helping people sort of make those decisions in their lives. And I told him that I wanted to make this transition. I wanted to be a full-time composer, wanted to spend more time with my family, teach more. And the first thing we talked about was, well, let's look at the relationships that you have. Have you built up enough over time where you could get started? Or are you going to have to start fresh? Are you going to have to, is this even viable? And so, it's kind of almost like the same thing I did with Dan when we did our startup, to get me on, because of onboarding. You sort of just open up your Rolodex and you look at everybody that you had contact with, and then you evaluate those contacts and the relationships that you have. And that's what I did. I just really sort of took a hard look at, if this is really feasible, do I have those kinds of relationships where people are going to actually take that leap of faith? If they get approached for a consortium, or just to actually support a commission, would they be open to it? And I was fortunate. We had built a really solid foundation over the years. So most of the people that I started writing music for folks that I've known for years.
Amazing. That's super, super helpful. Dan, anything to add there?
No, I mean, it's so wonderful. I think it's always great just to realize that the real human connections, that's the arena where everything happens. And, any real discussion is going to have to take into account not just the artistic product, but about the connections between those people. What are they looking for? What are their priorities? What are their dreams? Because a successful collaboration, whether it's a new commission with a composer or whether it's a violinist showing up and playing a solo, it should be also developing that organization, what they're looking to do, help them closer to their dreams, help them get closer to that unarticulated need that they're bashful about or isn't on the website yet. So I just want to highlight that. And then, from a manager's perspective, I think that the single biggest challenge that a lot of artists can face is trying to reach out to get responses before you've succeeded in building and cultivating a responsive network. It's like trying to pick up a piano while you also play it. It doesn't work. So a lot of times when there's issues there too, I advise people take the time. Do you really have a network that's responsive? That's because if you do, if you've got people that will talk to you and will generally get back to you, great, you're in business. That's often a kind of separate issue from getting things across. And that is true whether a manager is handling stuff or whether an artist is handling them without a manager or whether they're in collaboration, which is usually what Jeff was outlining. And all good management relationships, I think, are really about great communication and collaboration. People have to work together in different ways, not duplicating efforts, but by bringing their distinct mojo to the game. So that's something I think about a lot and think about how to complement amazing artists like Jeff rather than just duplicating, the energy and the personal connection he has. So that's something we think a lot about in onboarding is figuring out what is everybody's respective role and how do we lead with a clear plan of action for these contacts as well as a way of evaluating it, the timeline for accomplishing it. Those are things that are often missing. And without that, you're just kind of doing outreach into this very amorphous suet-like block. So that's very important to me that we understand where we are. We have a way of locating our efforts there because otherwise it can really be a lot.
Yeah, no, this makes perfect sense. And actually, you've both sort of lightly referred to a process called onboarding, which is something that many folks may not be familiar with in terms of how you start engaging with a manager or agent if you happen to have one. Would either of you like to talk about what that means for those who might be coming at that for the first time?
Sure, I'll take that here just because, I think that it's important to recognize anytime you have a new management relationship, of course, we're going to start doing things right away. But that doesn't mean at the moment we sign that the manager just unilaterally starts taking a bunch of productive action, especially for the reason we just discussed with contacts. And it's really important to maximize those relationships, to see where there's opportunity, to match conversations to the right kind of project. But more importantly, I think it's like a doctor taking the Hippocratic Oath. We don't want to do any damage. The last thing we want to do is go in and introduce Jeff Scott as like a brand new up and coming composer to someone that he's worked with for 25 years, right? So I think that's a lot of what onboarding is about taking the time, first of all, to understand the contact history that we already discussed. But for us, a lot of it is things that might be less glamorous, more just kind of housekeeping stuff. Something that's really important at Visconti Arts is that we have all artists on a Google Calendar, which is really important because it allows us to give, quick responses to presenters or orchestras that are interested rather than having to do a lot of back and forth. Hopefully saves time because heck, Jeff is really busy. He's trying to compose, doing all this other amazing stuff. So we want to try to cut down on routine things. So there's a lot of setup like that, setting up for, we sign for artists, we handle payments and direct deposit those. So there's a lot of things like that that have to be set up. And if we take a hot minute to do them at the beginning, everything else moves a lot quicker. So that's kind of what we think about. It's a recognition also of that shared commitment and the idea that we as an agency can't be fully up and running until we have these things, until we have them set. So it's a good way for us to be able to make sure that we're really clear about that. One thing that we don't want is a case where we're not able to do a great job for artists. And it's just because we don't have their calendar, like we've never went through their contacts. So it's a way to kind of, make clear that that's a compact, it's an agreement, and it's something where both parties have to contribute.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And so everything that you've described, while you might be watching this webinar thinking, what does that have to do with the commissioning process? The reality is that the every step that you described is removing friction from those conversations. It's removing the time that it takes to know, is my artist available on this date? How much would this commission cost? All, and who should I be reaching out to with this type of idea that you have a relationship with? So whether you're doing this for yourself or whether you have an agent on your team, being able to get to the point where you can answer those questions pretty immediately while you have the focused attention of somebody who has an inbox that is overflowing with potential pitches is actually more important than you might even think. So I just want to stress that. So let's get into some of the basics here and the start of the commissioning process. So Dan, I'm going to throw this one at you because you and I have done this song and dance before. The question about the commission as a relay race. This is a metaphor that has stuck with me for years. I wonder if you can kind of describe, like, what is a commission to begin with, and tell me about how it is like the relay race.
So, a commission is a really interesting creature because it's really hard to get. And as composers, you know this. And the reason that they're hard to get is that the composer has a lot of leeway in terms of the kind of piece they can turn in. You can define a lot of things in an agreement, but it's hard to say, we want to make sure we get a great piece, or we're hoping for a piece that was just like that one. So, I think the reason that a commission process is like a relay race is it's about the progressive transfer of power. And different parties hold the baton at different points in the process, and that leads to kind of different intrigues about the system. So let me walk you through, and everyone listening to this, whether you're a composer or whether you're a presenter, should probably be nodding or groaning at certain parts of it. The first part is prospecting. It's hard to get a commission. And for reasons we'll get into at the end of it, there's good reasons for that. People are very selective, and oftentimes people will do about anything else, including doing existing works, arrangements of other chamber works for orchestra, before they will do that commission. So it's so hard, and oftentimes composers feel like they're auditioning, they're supplicating. And then in the middle part of the process, it's always so interesting because things are shared, but there's a point where the composer takes that baton and they go away. And often the presenter is saying, oh my gosh, will the piece come in on time? Is everything okay? Things will come up along the way. Discoveries will be made. And some of that is an artistic process, but some of it is also a refinement of the business agreement and figuring out how we deal with the reality of the product as it's made. And, the final stage is so interesting because that baton goes back. And I remember in my former life, there was one time that I had been working on a project for a chamber group for a while, and that there was somebody on stage who proceeded to play a line of music that was nothing at all that I had ever written, and just kind of looked at me while they were doing it as if to say, like, what are you going to do? And that's a fact. That's a tough reality, is that we don't have the baton as composers in that moment. So that's why, as much as we can do to understand the journey of commissioning and about kind of the different challenges at each stage, and also how one can endear oneself. So just to look at one spot, as the composer, one of the things I'm always advising composers on our roster to do is to make sure that you're in great communication, that you're giving the commissioner regular updates way before the due date, because that's wonderful. Everyone loves to hear updates without having to be the one to prompt them. And, a lot of times figuring out that way of artistic collaboration, a lot of times where great pieces encounter problems is if there's an amazing, bold new idea. And that's what we want. We don't want to eliminate those problems by eliminating bold new ideas, but we want to figure out a great way of incorporating them and having them be successful. And in genres like opera, where workshopping is built into the progress, like that's a little bit easier to do. More and more orchestras are doing stuff like ACO is doing, supporting with readings, with workshop sessions where people can actually try that out. But absent that, something that I think is also important is the ability to try out compositional ideas in bite-sized ways, or try out this new technique of notation before it's kind of stitched all the way in. So, that's another area of passing the baton, is that wise holders of the baton know that if they share it, they'll have best results. So that goes for the orchestra. The more that you open it up to the composer and say, what would be good? What are things that we can do to support your work? The better the outcome will be. But same thing for composers. The more that we try and be responsive and caring and understanding what our partners are going through, that's successful. So that's a little bit of that overall metaphor. And of course, we can get into consortium commissioning, which is altogether different and adds more fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I appreciate the nuance to that metaphor where it's most successful if two hands are holding on to the baton for as long as possible. I really appreciate that. And especially as an organization where 5 out of 6 pieces on a concert are probably going to be world premieres. If everyone has a bold new idea we don't know about, the concert looks very different than we thought. So it is a helpful thing. So Jeff, I want to come back to you now. We have, in order to sort of dig into the process of commissioning and also in particular building consortia, we've sort of picked 3 different projects of yours to dive into in a little more specific, running from, sort of more less complicated to more complicated, perhaps. And we have a couple of one sheets to share and things like that. But I wonder if we might start with the consortium for David Schifrin as a first example. So if you could tell us just a little bit about that project and how it came to be.
Oh, my, talk about a relationship. David Schifrin, he took on presenting Imani Wins when we were probably at our youngest and most raw. Um, it has to be 24, 25 years ago. We were probably 4 or 5 years into our thing, and but he saw the potential. Um, and we went out there and we did our thing, and he kept bringing us back like every two. Well, he has a Chamber Music Northwest is principally where he would invite us. But he was also instrumental in getting us and the Chamber Music Society up and coming group program. I can't remember the name of it now, but all this early on, and this relationship just built and built and built. And then there were some commissions along the way, small commissions for both myself and Valerie. But this was just something that again just goes back to this, just everybody committing to making the most out of the relationship and just committing to it and pushing growth and expansion and, like you were saying, bold ideas, um, and building community. We would go out there and do all these kind of community events. I met amazing people out there, and there are a particular bunch of folks out there that like to support the arts and commissioning, and they've made it possible for this particular commission to happen. Now, it comes because David Schifrin and I, whenever we were out there, he's one of those guys that likes to just go out and have food and drinks and laugh and share stories that have nothing to do with music. And I mean, sometimes nothing. He's just being a silly fellow, and we're all just like yucking it up. And I have to believe that, yeah, he likes my music, but I'm sure he likes a lot of people's music. And so here is his probably his last year that he's going to be playing out in Chamber Music Northwest. It's 50 years culminating, and he calls me and he says, "I'd love for you to write a signature piece for this big event," and he's going to be touring this piece. He said, "What do you think?" Like, what? What? Of all the amazing composers that are out there, that has to mean that it came from relationship building. Because I think of myself, and I know I don't. I know how I rate in terms of I know I write good music, but that's just not enough. It's never enough. It's never enough. And so we closed the deal basically by just saying that he just wanted to have a peace of mind because of the fun we've had over the years and the consistency of the things that I've been bringing over the years.
That's beautiful. And for those who are listening, I also just want to underline, that idea of relationships as being your greatest currency. People who know me know that I say that all the time, but it's not just about building a relationship in a professional context that's all about the transactional sale that's in front of you. It's actually about connecting as human beings and being helpful to one another over a long period so that that network is there for you when the opportunity arises, however many years later that might be. So I really love that story for that reason. So it sounds like it's a signature piece, and it speaks again to the reason we commission. Sometimes we commission because there's a special culminating event, there's a particular relationship, there's a signature for a particular soloist. So those are all of the things that I'm pulling out of this story. Dan, I wonder if there's anything you can share about the consortium building process on this that was particularly instructive.
Of course, it was really exciting to get to work on such a special project for this occasion, and a lot of the considerations came around that. So that the first thing I want to highlight is that this is a case where we have a consortium that's formed among different chamber music presenting organizations. However, we have one member, David Schifrin, who needs to have performance exclusivity. So that was a consideration. This project is happening because it's all about celebrating him. It was instigated by him. So it's absolutely right that he should be the clarinetist associated with it during the premiere period. So one of the things that we worked out discussing an exclusivity period by which he is the only clarinetist who can be performing it. And typically there's different ranges for that. About 2 years is often appropriate. And then, of course, after that period, it becomes possible for others to join in. But we made that line up with the period of the consortium being open. A lot of times I see people keep a consortium open only for about a season, which sometimes can make sense. I think increasingly keeping that period open for 2 seasons can be wonderful just because it allows more people to buy in and spread that out. And it also allows any performers associated to spread out their performances too. So, we're not giving poor David like 8 performances over one season, although, I'm sure he would love that too. So those were some considerations thinking about exclusivity. It's not always just en masse for the whole ensemble. Sometimes, especially in chamber cases or with an orchestral soloist, that will come into play. And then maybe one other thing to highlight is that, there's many ways to do the same thing. And there's not always one that is strictly the best. Sometimes there's just the best tool for the best job. And something that I see in consortia a lot is that there's these two basic ways of breaking it down. One is to have a single agreement in which we know everyone who's signing on, we get all those folks to sign that one agreement, done. That's not often the best case if you don't know who else is potentially going to join on, because then it can hold up the process. So something that we'll do sometimes, and this was a case in this commission for Chamber Music Northwest and David Schifrin, is that we have an initial contract for the lead commissioner defining their anchor contribution, and then we define the process by which it's possible to add other consortium members there. Now, some of that can be challenging because in doing so, we transfer risk. We take risk from that lead commissioner and we say, don't worry, we, the agency, will assume the responsibility for making this happen. But in doing so, what we're able to do is to get this started, get it set, and that way, hopefully Jeff can get some of his initial fee. He has the security to start writing. The presenter has the security to go ahead and know that this will happen. We don't have to wait. So that's something that I see is often very helpful. In this case, we have an agreement where we're looking to add some other presenters. We have just had a wonderful sign on from Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, where David also has a great relationship. So again, just coming back to the theme of relationships again, in this case too, a lot of our prospecting is absolutely chamber music societies where David has had a big impact. That's absolutely the places that are most likely to be responding. It doesn't mean that's the only kind of presenter we're talking to, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't thinking about those most obvious low-hanging fruit connections. So those are a couple of things I'd highlight there.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really great. And, I think that one of the things that I'm taking away from this, so the idea of having a soloist and the exclusivity, like when a soloist commissions for themselves, it can often be really important that they're the only one who gets to play it for a while. Dan, I wonder when you work with composers on your roster, especially those who are kind of early in their career, what are the pluses and minuses of attaching a soloist to a project?
That's a good question. So, you know what? I'll tell you once. I was talking to a very famous conductor who has been very kind to me in my former life, as well as some artists on her roster. And she pointed out that, there's so many great consortium projects that come across her desk that all have a soloist attached to it or something else. And one thing that she doesn't see a lot of, which I've corroborated, is consortium proposals for just a standalone orchestra work of symphonic nature. No soloist, no narrator, no singer, no multimedia. So that's really interesting to think about because sometimes soloists add costs. And a lot of times too, they can add challenges of navigating too. You write a great piece for a trumpet soloist, which we'll come to later. That's great. You're going to have to deal with things like brass politics, especially at group one orchestras have all kinds of contracts and restrictions for brass players. And you're going to have to deal with things like programming. But we just had a trumpeter last season, and what do you think we could do that like every year? We need to spread this out. So it's more promising, but you have to thread the needle. And I think that's something that we always want to think about. The other thing I'd say with soloist is that it's worth considering in this case. Oftentimes, the soloist will have their own exclusivity agreement that is separate from any orchestras. Melissa, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. Generally, I find that it makes sense for orchestras to have a certain limited exclusivity, mainly to deal with rescheduling, mainly to assure them, hey, if you have to reschedule this later in the season, we're not going to all of a sudden now charge you rental fees too, or something like that. But I find for composers, it's really important to be in a situation where they're able to get that work out in the event that nobody performs it. We don't want situations in which a performer could hold on to a work for a long time without performing it. That's awful for composers. It's nice to be paid, but honestly, a challenge we see a lot is that if somebody pays for commission and then decides that they don't want to perform it, a lot of times they've technically fulfilled, their requirements, and a lot of contracts do not obligate the performer to do that. So those are things that we think about a lot, and I'm happy to get into more areas too.
Yeah, for sure. And just to answer your question, ACO is a little weird in that regard from the perspective that our entire purpose is composer advancement. So it would be very strange for us to request exclusivity on pieces in a way that prevents the composer from getting additional performances. That is the whole reason we commission and exist. So we don't really require that. And we also are rather agnostic as to whether we get the premiere a lot of the time, because we want to make sure that the piece has as long of a life as possible. So I would definitely encourage, as orchestras are thinking about how to structure these terms, that they think about realistically how many times they're going to play that piece in a defined period of time. The answer is often not an enormous number. And if that is the case, like, what are they gaining from retaining exclusivity that they couldn't do just by making sure that the premiere has some sort of, that they have the premiere, that they might have the first right to record it, that there might be some like geographic, exclusivity for a certain period of time. Other than that, fly, have a great time. These are all really good things. I would feel differently if I were a soloist or a touring ensemble for which that piece might be a saleable signature over a long period of time. So I wonder if we can then move on to the trumpet concerto as a different example. So Jeff, back to you. Curious if you could tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah. Oh man. So Mary Elizabeth Bowden is a soloist, but she's also the founding member of the Seraph Brass. And we actually didn't know each other. Maybe she had heard about me, but I was doing a sabbatical for a colleague at University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I was faculty brass, and one of the trumpet players was playing in Seraph Brass, and that's where that relationship started. And so we sort of bonded there, and went out for drinks and yada 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 and so on. That was in 2018. Yeah, 2018 or 19, can't remember. And then about a year and a half later, I get this email from Mary asking if I'd be interested in writing something for Seraph Brass. I, I can't imagine it happened any other way than, the word of mouth sort of passed around. And that one other thing that is just so obvious is that once you get to a certain level in our field, everybody knows everybody or has heard of it. They know you. And so, she approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in writing something for Seraph Brass. I did. It was really successful. Actually ended up being the title track from the last CD that they put out. That relationship built. And then she approached me and asked if I'd be interested in writing a trumpet concerto. Well, and then pinch me. Sure, I'd love to. For such an amazing soloist, and that meant, of course, then engaging management. That's basically how I met Dan. But that whole process then set into play, making that possible, because that's for orchestra, and that means a bigger commission and more people involved, touring and so forth. I'm sure Dan could take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pause here just one second. And for those of you who have been putting questions into the Q&A, I'm going to be peppering them throughout our presentation. I want to pause here for one reason, which is, Jeff, you've entered the field of composition at a very particular phase of your life where a lot of people already knew who you were. And Dan, I wonder if you can address, especially when you're advising composers who are just getting started, what would you do to build a consortium if you didn't already have all of these relationships? What are some of the ways that you might suggest proposing that, and what might the advantages?
That's a really great question. And some of that is always the kind of bootstrap question. I think so many things are geared for everyone other than composers who are getting that start. So here's a couple tips that I might share. It's hard up there, but one of the things, first of all, is in the same way that a wise military historian once said that it's not a great idea to start a war or a battle if you haven't evaluated if you're able to overwhelmingly win that. And I think it's the same thing. We talked about taking the time to build a responsive network. That is the foundation. Focus on that first, because if you don't have a responsive network, even a small one, all your other activities and attempts to outreach won't be as successful. So I would say start with fundamentals, just focus on cultivating that. I would also say that take advantage of the magic of your collaborators. One of the great things that I've seen working with Jeff and Mary for this project, there are a bunch of folks who know Jeff. They know his music. Some of them mainly know him from Amani Winds and have, heard that he's composing more and more, but maybe they haven't heard as much of his latest stuff. And I have to educate them and share them. There's some people that they know Mary. They love her. They haven't heard about Jeff as much, but they want to know what Mary's latest is. They know her recent album that just came out with all contemporary trumpet concerti. They know other composers that she's worked with. Some people know both Jeff and Mary, and that's great. But the idea that there's overlapping Venn diagram here of different relationships. So that's something too. If Jeff was a young composerling and just starting out, one of the things that I would be advising him to do to absolutely be looking for relationships with the kind of soloist, kind of other groups where you can help absorb some of those and share them, because that's absolutely a good reason to pick somebody to work with. You got to like their music, or you got to love that soloist, but it has to be set up where hopefully it can lead to an outcome that's good for both of you. That's really important, because when collaborations are unbalanced, it doesn't work. I remember when I was growing up, there's someone, oh, I wish I could write a concerto for Yo-Yo Ma. And I'm thinking now, oh, that'd be a terrible idea for like an 18-year-old composer who doesn't have any credit. All the power would be with the soloist, and there would almost be no agency, no ability to get a good fee. Sometimes the dream scenario is not that. What the real dream scenario is working with the cellist who's, in the dorm room across, whether, and for me, it was like Mike Block, Joshua Roman, fantastic cellists. Go with those people, grow with those people. So say, find your peers, find people who might actually be in a similar situation as you, even people who don't have other contacts too, because it's through growing together that you'll achieve that. So take the time to grow. There's no shortcut, but a lot of those things and connections come from those other stages. Last thing I would say, make sure that you have materials, website, having something like a clear one sheet, which we'll show an example of in a second, and also just making sure that your website clearly lists your pieces, your offerings, their duration, their instrumentation. The amount of times back when I was a curator, there's some composer I was interested in. They had a piece and it was just called octet. No duration, no instrumentation. I know there's no recording, so there's no score. And all the time it takes to email back and forth, there's other composers that have that information ready. So the best thing you can do is to make it be very easy for people to consider your music and get to know it, remove barriers in that way. But I'd be curious for other thoughts on that. But I know ACO deals with a lot of these questions too, right?
Yeah, for sure. And before you've made the perfect segue to the next thing, which is actually showing some of those materials. But before I go there, just to reinforce one of the things you said, that idea of growing with a collaborator, or also maybe picking someone who is just a notch ahead so you can like grab some of their contacts in the course of this process. Those are both really great pieces of advice, because whether it is a soloist or even in some cases it's an orchestra, and I also have to just like tip my hat to the wind band world, and wind ensembles. Those folks know how to build consortia like nobody else on earth. So if you find a champion, someone who is really wants to have a piece from you, might not be able to afford the whole thing. I personally have created consortia for composers that I was interested in just because I wanted to, not because it was really necessarily my job, but I couldn't afford their full fee. I wanted to make the thing happen. And I'm going to call like two or three of my friends to make that work. So finding your champions can be a great thing. And now, Dan, back to your perfect segue. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the materials that you and Jeff have created for this concerto. And I'm happy to pull that up on screen if that is a helpful thing to do.
That sounds great. While you're doing that, a quick little tangent that Jeff alluded to. So Mary, trumpeter, was already on the Visconti Arts roster. Jeff was not a composer on our roster when this project started, because this happens all the time. We have artists on a roster collaborate with all kinds of artists. So Jeff was what we like to call a roster buddy coming in. I was just handling this particular project of his, but that was a great way for us to get to know each other. So when you think about how do relationships happen with management too, sometimes it takes a while to get to know each other. It takes a while to decide if you should go further. So this one sheet is just an example of the kind of thing that we would be sharing with presenters. So don't literally copy everything from this because it's not something, I wouldn't say this is the right way to do everything all times. But for this project, this represents where we landed based on a couple factors. So I just want to highlight here, starting clearly, what is this project? Title, idea. And Jeff had one of the most amazing ideas for this project. I'll let him share more about it later, but it casts soloist Mary as kind of like a modern incarnation of the Greek goddess of wisdom and wars, kind of as a modern mediator who's reconciling rather than leading through overwhelming monstrous force. It's a really great parable for our times, but it also is the ideal thing if you think about from a soloist perspective. I mean, Mary was absolutely over the moon over this. It's such a great showcase for her. So first of all, before we get into the business stuff, like Jeff, props, like this is how you write for a soloist. This is how you create something. When a soloist dreams of commissioning concerto, they want something that features them and celebrates them and taps into their identity. So I feel like that's just a slam dunk here. And I think anyone who looks at this, has definitely noticed that. So we want to lead with a little bit what it's about. We want to make sure that you get to hear from the artists about not just Jeff, who wrote some beautiful program notes you'll see later, but Mary, why is she commissioning this? What's exciting about it? And then a little bit further down, you see that we've got some just basic details here. We want to have those at a glance, so anyone who's considering can very quickly see. Biggest things are what's the consortium period, instrumentation, some basics about it. One thing I want to highlight is that dealing with fees can be different. In this case, because we're working with a trumpet soloist, one of the issues is in brass politics, it's very hard to get trumpet soloists at Group 1 orchestras. And a lot of that has to do with contracts that exist with principal players and obligations for concerti, other things then. So we know as far as designing this project, we're going to be aiming for generally smaller and a couple of mid-sized orchestras. And as a result, we're probably going to be looking at orchestras that have less to contribute in terms of fees. So that's one of the reasons in this case too, you'll see that we have what the total ballpark fee is there too. And that's something because it allows smaller orchestras to understand that what might seem like a whole lot to them, like $1,000 or $2,000 contribution, is actually just a very small part of what it takes. That's part of education, because sometimes we have to educate about the project. We also have to educate about how much does a commission cost. This is an extremely reasonable fee, I might say, for a composer of Jeff's stature for this particular project. So just for anyone else watching here, you can't always get them for such a great fee, but this was a really great case too of everyone working together and designing a project, designing expectations based around what was likely to succeed and likely to bring in the right kind of partners. One of the other things I'll highlight here is you'll see other rep, because this concerto doesn't exist in a vacuum. Mary is well known for doing other concerti, and she often commissions shorter concerti by great contemporary composers, people like Rena Esmail, Sarah Kirkland Snyder, to pair with. She's also done things like commissioned 6 to 8 minute duets from awesome up and coming composers. And those are things she can offer to play with the orchestra's principal. This has happened several times where we've been able to look at adding bookings like that, other rep. So some of this is like our arsenal. It's not just, oh, do this project with Jeff and Mary. They're both great. It's like, here's all the stuff that you would need to consider it. Here's other stuff. And you can see if we go down, there's a link to Mary's full rep list too. So again, we're just trying to give all the information that someone would need. Here you can see at the bottom of the sheet, you go, oh, the full recording and score. Now, we didn't have this at the start. So that's a good example. You don't have to have everything complete. We can be updating this info as more and more stuff comes in. Each new update is a great chance to reach out and kind of nudge partners here. We don't always have to say, hey, did you make a decision yet? Sometimes it's just, hey, sharing the good news that we have a premiere, sharing the good news that we got a full score if it's helpful to consider. And then here you can see later in all your free time, read some of Jeff's beautiful program notes here, which are so effective. These, I believe, are kind of synonymous with kind of the final program notes that we would see in a program. A lot of times those don't exist or they come. So again, we would start with something small. This came in later. And I want people to read this knowing that, oh, Jeff didn't have this fully formed like 3 years ago and write this out. This evolved over time and we updated materials. So let's see, Melissa, are there things that you would want to highlight there? I think those are the main things. Everything else is just some bio info for the artist.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the thing that I would say here is it is really helpful to hear some of the things that were in particular considerations as you were setting this up. I will also highlight, and just a compliment to you both, these materials are clear, they're beautiful, the language is evocative, the photography is gorgeous. sometimes just using simple tools like Canva or however else, whatever else you have access to make the project come to life in a way that feels built and professional can be the difference between someone taking you seriously and not. But I also just want to note that Dan, you also included a example of one in progress, which I'm going to kind of like go down here. It's another one of Jeff's projects. And, for anyone who might be watching and saying, oh my gosh, I don't have a manager. I don't know everything about what this thing is going to be. How am I supposed to put something like this together? Like, what is the place where you would start if you were trying to put materials together to open the discussion?
So this is a great example of exactly that. In keeping with the theme that you want to capture some vitals, capture what you know. Because here's something, I want to also share some good news. The best thing to do with a new project is to go to potential partners when there's still room for their input. The goal is not to have something that's completely finished. That's the worst option. That leaves zero room for their input. And that if you do that, people will literally tell you what it would take to make something accessible, and then you can put that back and they will go for it. It's that simple. So I just want to highlight that. This is a great case where Jeff knows a lot of the basics. He has a sense of the instrumentation, the duration, the forces involved. I want to highlight that because that is really useful. You never know what you know and what you don't know. But I'll tell you, if you have some basics about the container, the basic constraints, if you're like, I have this great opera and it's got a great topic, but I don't know how long it's going to be. I don't know what the forces would be. I don't know the size of the orchestra. Oh gosh, it's really hard. So I will say this meets kind of the bare minimum criteria that we would want to see about some of those forces so that someone could consider it. It's got great information about the story. There's some other synopsis info that Jeff has provided that we're going to be adding and updating this later. And we've got, again, great bio info on who are the collaborators, especially because there might be folks who know Jeff a lot more than these collaborators. There might be folks who know Jeff as a great composer of orchestral music, but not as much as what he's been doing and getting into opera and more. So that's everybody's at a different stage, and we want to make sure that everybody has a window in the seeing thing. So this is an example. It's really simple, but you don't need to have everything set. Leave that open, and actually going and asking people to help fill in that complete the blanks is a really great thing to do.
Yeah, that's really great. And thank you for opening all of this up. I know it can feel very vulnerable to say, hey, here are my projects in development, but it's very helpful for those of us watching. Jeff, I want to just come back to you for one more thing. The money talk, right? Like when it gets to the point where you're on the phone with a potential commissioner and the money, you gave me a line that just cracked me up. I wonder if you can talk to me about the role of the artist and the role of the manager in those discussions if one were to happen to have one.
Well, it's one of the most difficult things for artists to be able to vocalize their worth. Um, and it's also one of the things that's not talked about a lot in our business. What fees are sort of common for certain, tier composers and soloists and that sort of thing. And so you end up having these conversations sometimes with folks that are at really high levels, still asking you, "Hey, what are you getting? Can I ask you what you get for that?" That commission. So there's that involved, but then there's the other part of it is that because at this level we're talking about relationships that have been built over time, it's probably in my best and most composers' best interest when the conversation shifts from the artistic part to the financial part to let the people who do that do their job. And so I remember just recently Dan and I were on a call about a potential commission, and we were all talking about the niceties and the post possibilities and what I could contribute. And then the conversation switched to, oh, well, we should probably talk about whether or not we can afford this. And the first thing I said was, gentlemen, I think this is where I bow out because I want, first of all, it's not my place to contribute. This is purely why you have management, to have these sort of tough conversations, but also because I don't want to influence it because of the relationship that I have, which and I don't know how most composers might do, but I'm that nice guy. I'm that nice guy, and if I have a relationship with someone that spans over 15 or 20 years, it's really tough for me to ask what the going rate is, because the going rate is, it is what it is. But there's so many other people that are involved, and it is what it is because of that. And so that's where you sort of bow out and let people who have that position, have that job, do their job.
Yeah, this is great. And I'm getting three different versions of the same question, which basically sum up to, and Dan, I'm going to point this to you because before you were a manager, you were a self managed composer who also negotiated his own fees. It's part of how you're so successful for others right now. What do you do if you don't have one?
So that's a great question. So first of all, you can do a lot of this yourself because a lot of what any manager or agent would do is simply something that an artist can do. Here's the good news. One thing I always tell artists is that anytime you have an additional degree of separation between the artist, the power goes down. So it's great. You want to have a manager, especially in certain cases. It can really help smoothing over discussing money and things like that. But I would say that the biggest thing, if you don't have your own manager, first of all, do a lot of the preliminary work we've already talked about. Organize your contacts, work on building that responsive network. That's the prerequisite to everything else. Past that, think about when you're pitching your work, when you're advocating for yourself. I think that it's always really good to not come across as entitled and to come across as trying to learn more. Pitching things is glorified. If we think about also, recent shows, things like Mad Men about advertising, Shark Tank, where it's all, oh, the pitch, the moment of the pitch is so important. It's actually just the tip of the iceberg. That's what you see. What you don't see is all of the care in matching that and being really careful. So I would say that, for if you don't have a manager, I would say really focus on situations where you can articulate the value, where you can say, hey, you know what? I know your orchestra has been doing a lot, commissioning composers who are doing new multimedia collaborations. And you know what? I've been having this collaboration. I see your orchestra has been doing a lot with local stories. And as luck would have it, I'm collaborating with the state's poet laureate right now. That doesn't mean they're going to say yes, but I think that what hopefully what we're trying to do is see if there's ways that you can get in the door that create a meaningful opportunity for discussion. I think that would be something that I highlight. When you can't bifurcate those different things about money and stuff like that, what I would say is that try to set the conversation. Try to see what you can do to discuss and learn more, and be flexible, because if you don't know what an organization can provide or what's possible, that means that you don't actually know what's reasonable. You know what's reasonable for you and what you deserve, but you may not understand what's possible for them. And that's the difference in knowing if somebody is just withholding and being a jerk, or they need help. Maybe you need to suggest grants. Maybe you need to suggest, I'd like to help form a consortium. I've been talking to these two other partners. I think it would be a great way to get this off the ground and help reduce the burden that you would have to pay. Now you're the hero. You're the, hey, you know what? I really liked all our discussions, and I've noticed that there's a grant from the Fromm Foundation we could apply for that would pay for my commission. It would pay the group a small honorarium. What do you say? I'll take the lead in getting it all set. That's the key. If you can position yourself to be helpful and finding solutions for other people, whether you're a manager or whether you're an artist, you're going to find that you're somebody who's very valuable.
Great. So we're nearing the end here, and thank you to everyone for a few extra minutes. I know we were starting just a couple minutes late here. So I'm going to play a game called Answer This Question in 1 minute, one sentence or less. So the first one is, where can an independent composer learn about going rates for commissions from solo to chamber to orchestra? Resources.
Oh, definitely. American Composers Forum. They have it all listed on the website. That would actually be the first place I would go as a composer.
Yeah, great. And then as a composer, if you're coming to consortium, how much of the piece should be sketched or finished before reaching out to potential commissioners?
Well, that's a tough one because again, sometimes you want it depends on what kind of piece you're writing, but sometimes you want folks to be part of the process. And it's like particularly with Mary Bowden, I wanted her to be part of the process. There were conversations that had to be had, but I definitely wanted to have a couple of ideas, and so it's like thinking about like what is your concept, have things out sort of sketched out conceptually. Maybe that might inspire some themes or something like that, some things that you might want to present to potential people, but that'll also help define who it is you might approach to be part of that consortium.
Great. And Dan, last one is to you. When should composers approach artist management as a career stage? And how do you best learn about artists that you want to work with?
Great question. I think generally I advise artists at the right time to talk to artist management is when you're getting so much incoming that you're no longer able to handle it yourself. Otherwise, I tend to advise artists, keep the full percentage of your own work. Do that. That's often a better deal for you too. I would say that some of the great ways to meet artists, that you never know where you're going to meet artist managers, but always reach out. A lot of times you'll meet them backstage at some other event like that. So, it's something that I'd recommend just because we have very little time. It's a quick roll. Say hi, see if you can get their info, follow up later. Because in the same way you wouldn't hit someone up for a commission, usually if I'm backstage at Carnegie Hall, it's not really the time that I'm going to get in an in-depth discussion. However, it's a great chance for me to meet someone and maybe follow up later, whether they follow up or whether they let me know that they'd like to reach out. So that's good. I would think also about other collaborators. We keep coming back to relationships being your greatest currency, but think about that. Just like I mentioned with Jeff and Mary, a lot of times it could be another colleague. Maybe it's not another composer, but another performer that you're working with, like that too. So take the time to ask and look at your existing connections, because that's really some of the best way to build that.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I just want to thank you both so much for today. There's so much more that could be said at all times with you both, with your infinite wisdom and experience in doing this work. Jeff, congratulations on some incredible projects. It's so great to see you at this phase in your career. Dan, thank you so much for all you're doing for composers and artists on your roster and all of the orchestras, opera companies, and ensembles who are supporting their work. And LaRob, I'm coming back to you.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you all for joining today. Jeff, Dan, Melissa, thank you for your fabulous work during this webinar. And thank you all for joining today despite the technical difficulties. We appreciate your patience and your undivided attention for this fabulous conversation. We do welcome your feedback on today's session, so please use the link in the chat to complete a short survey. And another huge thank you to our Earshot partners, the American Composers Forum, the New Music USA, and the League of American Orchestras, in addition to many other individuals and organizations who have made Earshot possible through their support. The Altman Foundation, Elizabeth and Justus Schlichting, Mellon Foundation, Sphinx Venture Fund, TD Charitable Foundation, Fromm Foundation, the Ford Good Neighbor Committee, Aaron Copeland Fund for Music, Alice M. Ditson Fund of Columbia University, and of course the League of American Orchestras with support for the Virginia B. Toolman Foundation. Also, there are public funds provided by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Thank you all so much for attending today. And if you'd like to find all of this information and more, please check out our Learning Lab on our website, americancomposers.org. Thank you for your time and have a good rest of your Monday.